Amazing Couples by Victor Yup and Doris Mock. Chapter 8. As Tears Go By. 1 Samuel chapter 1 verses 1 to 20. Kurt Cobain, the founder and leader of the grunge band Nirvana, was the most acclaimed and creative singer of his generation, the artist of his decade, the 90s, according to Time magazine. His parents divorced when he was 8, and 2 of his father's uncles had committed suicide. Marriage and the birth of a daughter were supposed to bring calm, stability, and perspective to the brooding singer, but 3 years after the band had achieved fame and at the height of his popularity, Cobain put a shotgun to his own head at the young age of 27 in 1994. In a suicide note left behind to his family and for his fans, Cobain revealed, "I haven't felt the excitement for so many years. I feel guilty beyond words about these things. When we are backstage and the lights go out and the manic roar of the crowd begins, it doesn't affect me. The fact is, I can't fool you, any of you. It simply isn't fair to you or to me. The worst crime I can think of would be to trick people by faking it and pretending as if I were having 100% fun. I don't have the passion anymore, so remember, it's better to burn out than to fade away." A 2003 study suggested that 13% of the American workforce loses productivity from headaches, back pain, arthritis, and other common painful conditions, and as many as 50 million or so pain patients in the nation suffer pain. Pain can be physical, emotional, or mental. Chronic emotional and mental suffering is more dangerous than migraine headaches, lower back pain, or rheumatoid arthritis. Time magazine in fall 1997 describes how pain travels technically in the body. A pain signal is set off by the stimulation of nerve endings. The signal goes to the spinal cord, where it passes instantaneously to a motor nerve, one connected to a muscle in the leg. This causes a reflex action that does not include the brain, but the signal also goes up to the spinal cord to the thalamus, too, where pain is received. The story of Samuel, the last judge of Israel, begins with the heartbreak suffered by his mother Hannah. Hannah's suffering was likened to that of Job, Hagar, and Israel in Egypt. Childlessness reduced her to tears. She felt that she was nothing like others. She had less than others, and despised by others. Years and years, verse 7, of the same disparaging remarks, brutal treatment, and mind games from her rival made her tearful, miserable, and despondent. What can one do in such an uneven fight, with such an obnoxious person, or in such an inescapable situation? What resources do we have to overcome the feelings of hurt, insignificance, and rejection? First, master the art of looking away. 1 Samuel chapter 1, verses 4 to 8. And when the time was that Elkanah offered, he gave to Peninnah his wife, and to all her sons and her daughters, portions. But unto Hannah he gave a worthy portion, for he loved Hannah. But the Lord had shut up her womb. And her adversary also provoked her sore, for to make her fret, because the Lord had shut up her womb. And because the Lord had closed her womb, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. This went on year after year. Whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her till she wept and would not eat. Elkanah, her husband, would say to her, "Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons?" A Jewish story in a treasury of Jewish folklore tells of how tears were given to us and why they are valuable to us. After Adam and Eve had been banished from the Garden of Eden, God saw that they were penitent and took their fall very much to the heart. And as He is a compassionate Father, He said to them gently, "I know that you will meet with a lot of tribulation in the world, and that it will embitter your lives. For that reason I gave to you of my heavenly treasure this priceless pearl. Look." They saw a droplet of water. It is a tear. And when grief overtakes you and your heart aches so that you are not able to endure it, and great anguish grips your soul, then there will fall from your eyes this tiny tear. Your burden will grow lighter then. Here are some quotations about crying. Heavy hearts, like heavy clouds in the sky, are best relieved by the letting of a little water. To weep is to make less the depth of grief. Tears are the safety valve of the heart when too much pressure is laid on it. Tears are summer showers to the soul. What soap is for the body, tears are for the soul. Unfortunately, Hannah did not master the art of looking away, looking elsewhere, or looking at something else. Looking away is not escaping, avoiding, or fleeing your critics, but shutting down, brushing aside, and ignoring opinions that are unfair, undeserving, or uninvited. Too often, problems add up, pile on, and get worse when we care too much or give too much weight to what people say, do, or think. The introduction to 1 Samuel is the most heart-wrenching and tear-jerking passage in the Bible. 7 gut-wrenching Hebrew words were chosen to describe in painstaking detail Hannah's suffering. The Hebrew word weep occurs 3 times, verses 7, 8, and 10. The words provoke, verses 6 and 7, and sore or anguish, verses 6, missing in NIV, and 16. Twice, and the words irritate, verse 6, downhearted, verse 8, bitterness of soul, verse 10, misery, verse 11, and deeply troubled, verse 15, all occur once. Put the 7 words another way. Provoke, verse 6, is to cause anger. Irritate, verse 6, is the sound. See 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 10, thunder. Psalm 96, verse 11, roar. Weep, verse 7, is once tears. Downhearted, verse 8, is the badness. Bitterness, verse 10, is the resentment. Misery, verse 11, is the disaster. And troubled, verse 15, is the hardening. Hannah cried and cried her eyes out, cried like the world had ended, like someone had died, and like she was abandoned. She withdrew and isolated herself, shut the world out and closed herself in, grieved and pained herself to a new high and a personal low. The childless mother was inconsolable. Her husband could not comfort her, and she did not answer him anyway. Tears were her breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Poor Hannah, she allowed Peninnah to get on her case, to get under her skin, and to get into her head. Provoke, verse 6, should be translated, surely provoked, because it is in the intensive in Hebrew. The word irritate, verse 6, appears for the first time in the Bible. All the other 12 occurrences of this Hebrew word are associated with the thunder of God's voice. 1 Samuel 2, verse 10, 7, verse 10, 2 Samuel chapter 22, verse 14, Job 37, 4 and 5, 40, verse 9, Psalm 18, verse 13, and 29, verse 3, or the roar of the seas, 1 Chronicles 16:32, Psalm 96:11, and 98:7, Ezekiel chapter 27:35. Of course, mortal grumbling, nagging, and harassing cannot compare with God's thunderous voice or nature's mighty roar. But Peninnah's strategy worked. Hannah did not just wince in pain. She burst out, blew up, and broke down in pain. Timid Hannah was not the type to talk back, to exact payback, or to bother others. She sucked in all the dirt, poison, and barbs. Once I noticed the license plate holder of a slow old driver that was inscribed with these words, "Don't like my driving? You should see me putt." Someone has said, no one can govern us without our permission. People can only do as much as we allow them to or yield to. Dallas Willard said, "You may even be able to destroy the soul of another, but you will never unlock it against their will." Andy Rooney said, "I have learned that I can't choose how I feel, but I can choose what I do about it." Hannah's bitterness of soul, verse 10, placed her in elite company, though she really did not belong there. This select phrase was selected by Job for his afflictions. Job 7:11 and 10:1, and by Hezekiah when he was sick to the point of death, Isaiah 38:15 and 17. But Hannah's suffering was merely mental and lightweight in comparison to Job and Hezekiah's physical torment. A lifetime of misery is guaranteed for people who look at nothing but themselves, their pain, and their unhappiness. Look at something else, think of something else, and attend to something else. Second, master the art of looking above. 1 Samuel chapter 1 verses 9 to 16. Once when they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli the priest was sitting on a chair by the doorpost of the Lord's temple. In bitterness of soul, Hannah wept much and prayed to the Lord. And she made a vow, saying, O Lord Almighty, if you will only look upon your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head. As she kept on praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli thought she was drunk and said to her, How long will you keep on getting drunk? Get rid of your wine. Not so, my lord, Hannah replied. I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief. Anne McCaffrey, an instructor at the Harvard Medical School, through a national telephone survey of 2,055 people, solicited information on how and how many people use prayer to help them feel better. The survey found that about 35% of people in the United States asked a higher power for help with their health. Of these 719 people, 75% prayed to stay healthy, and 22% prayed for relief of everything from back pain to cancer, headaches to heart problems. The majority of these people, or 69%, found that doing so was very helpful on a scale of very helpful through somewhat helpful to not helpful. What is more, some of them gave higher ratings to prayers than to their doctors. Of those who had cancer, 81% rated prayer as very helpful, while only 78% gave the same high mark to their physicians. For those with severe depression, the score was prayer, 68%, doctors, 48%. McCaffrey cautions that the survey did not ask which of the two was more helpful. You can't compare the two, she says. Physicians work toward finding the problem and treating it. Prayer goes to intangibles like coping, putting illness in a larger perspective, and quality of life. It's like apples and oranges. She found that women pray more than men. Those older than 33 years pray more than younger people. A different survey done by other researchers found that 84% of 64 to 85-year-olds use prayer as a form of complementary healing. McCaffrey says, You can't prove that God exists, so how can you prove that prayer works? People who have faith don't question the truth of either. People cannot find answers on earth or in themselves because they are looking in the wrong place and in the wrong direction. They fail to look up. They only look within and look around. When people are in pain, the last place they look is upward. However, the first and only person to understand is God. After crying behind closed doors, Hannah's tears did not stop or dry up. In fact, she cried longer and harder. Verse 10, wept much. But with a world of difference and in a different world and on a different plateau, she now knew where to cry, when to cry, and whom to cry to. The Hebrew text says Hannah later wept and wept, not before Peninnah, Elkanah, or Eli, but before the Lord. She prayed and wept and wept till she could weep no more. The weeping Hannah did in the temple was more intense than previously. Verse 10 records that Hannah wept much, or in Hebrew, Hannah wept. The Hebrew text emphasized Hannah's praying to the Lord before her weeping before him, unlike the Chinese and English traditional translations that have her weeping and praying. Verse 12 also noted that eventually she spent more time praying and less time weeping. She had a breakthrough. Prayer was now her focus and priority. The word surely, the intense form in Hebrew, is missing from verse 12's kept, which is a contrast to verse 6's surely provoking. The word kept is usually translated as multiplied and occasionally as increased, Genesis 7:18 and Leviticus 25:16. The same word was used to describe how the flood waters increased on the earth. Hannah multiplied, increased, and intensified her prayers to the Lord. Her prayers kept pace or grew stronger, Job 39:4, by the minute with every heartbreak, headache, and teardrop, till she forgot about weeping and focused on praying, verse 12. Praying in her heart, verse 13, was a big transformation to Hannah, whose previous irritation was loud as the rolling thunder and the raging waves. Verse 7. Instead of pouring out her heart to spouse, friend, or priest who could in no way understand her, Hannah poured out her heart and soul to the Lord. The word poured out, verse 15, is used of Old Testament sacrifices in pouring out the rest of the blood from an animal sacrificed at the altar of burnt offering. Leviticus 4:7, 4:18, 4:25, and 4:30. Hannah shed, Genesis 9:6, 37:22, Leviticus 17:4, Numbers 35:33, and Deuteronomy 19:10, 21:7, drained, Leviticus 17:13, and emptied her tears in God's presence. She did not hold back, keep inside, or bottle up her heartbreak. Hannah poured out great anguish, verse 16, complaint, and grief of biblical proportions to the Lord. Job, in Job 9:27, 10:1, 21:4, and 23:2, and David, Psalm 55:2, 64:1, and 142:2, were the only other two biblical characters who spoke of their anguish, Hebrew for complain, but none stated their case and condition as emphatically as Hannah. She poured out not just her anguish or complaint, but also her grief, and she poured out not just anguish, but great anguish or complaint. Good for her. She discharged her pain to the Lord instead of regurgitating everything within and swallowing her grief. In praying, Hannah's weeping in verse 7 was replaced by praying and weeping much, or weep, weep in Hebrew, verse 10, and eventually she kept on praying to the Lord, verse 12, minus the weeping. Hannah prayed more often than any other person in the Bible, according to the number of times the word pray occurs in the Bible. Weeping is painful. Weeping and praying is more hopeful, but praying longer than weeping is most helpful. Third, master the art of looking ahead. 1 Samuel chapter 1, verses 17 to 20. Eli answered, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him." She said, "May your servant find favor in your eyes." Then she went her way and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. Early the next morning they arose and worshipped before the Lord, and then went back to their home at Ramah. Elkanah lay with Hannah his wife, and the Lord remembered her. So in the course of time, Hannah conceived and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, saying, "Because I asked the Lord for him." During field training exercise at Parris Island, South Carolina, a drill instructor threw a pine cone among the recruits and yelled, "Grenade!" The trainees immediately turned away and hit the ground. "Just as I suspected," chided the instructor. "Not a hero among you. Didn't anyone want to jump on the grenade to save the others?" A little later, the instructor threw another pine cone and yelled, "Grenade!" This time, all the recruits but one jumped on the substitute explosive. "Why are you still standing there?" the instructor demanded. "Sir," the recruit replied, "someone had to live to tell about it." Haddon Robinson calculates how change occurs. Pain plus time plus insight equals change. The previously hopeless Hannah decided to live on, but her story did not have a conventional happy ending. She did not go home with a son, but just the blessing of a son. Her wish was not granted immediately. She went home with powerful, persuasive, and passionate words ringing in her ear. Go, verse 17, is an imperative, but a lot had changed for her, and more importantly, with her and in her. Eli did not promise her a baby, and he could not guarantee her happiness or understand her problem. But he advised her to go in peace, to rest her burdens, and leave them down in the temple before the altar and at the door, and not to bring unpleasantness, unkindness, and unrest home. Eli did not even inquire what her problem was. Hannah took Eli's advice to heart, and the Lord answered her prayer in another way. She had peace of mind, made peace with herself, and lived in peace from that time on. After pouring her grief to the Lord, she was able to walk out, pull herself together, and get on with life. It was time to face up to her enemy and her problems. She decided to return home, eat something, and cheer up. Surprisingly, things did not bother her as they used to before. She no longer feared life with her rival, her kids, and their antics. At the same time, smell, taste, and appetite returned. Sense, sensibility, and sensations returned to her. Hannah did not get what she wanted, and things were the same at home, but she was no longer irritated, inconsolable, or inferior. She had the courage to look ahead, brave insults, and live wisely. Hannah could put up with the past, cope with the present, and look to the future. She could look away, and her newfound strength came from looking above and looking ahead. The cycle of verbal abuse, personal jealousy, and outright rivalry was broken at that point. She had the will and courage to live, and she knew the way to live and the road to travel. Interestingly, but not coincidentally, Hannah's story reflects another woman's similar struggle, but with a twist in the end. In Genesis 30:22-24, God remembered the childless Rachel, who became pregnant and gave birth to a son by the name of Joseph. Rachel, too, was loved and had her rival, but she was the one who was jealous, Genesis 30, verse 1. The difference between the two women is that Rachel's closure came with her baby's birth, but Hannah, the mother of Israel's greatest judge, by faith and in faith, had closure before her baby Samuel was born. In verse 18, Hannah ate something, and her face was no longer downcast before she knew that the Lord would remember her in the next verse, verse 19. Also, Hannah's means were her prayers, but Rachel's methods were her plots. Conclusion. Samuel Chadwick said, "If successful, don't crow. If defeated, don't croak." Pain is a constant menace, a frequent companion, and a returning guest. Vindictiveness makes a person mean, ugly, and surly. Releasing your pain is more livable than repeating, retaining, or rehashing them. Do you turn to God rather than turn on others? Jesus suffered like one of us. He was tempted more than any one of us. Therefore, he is able to aid those who are tempted. Hebrews 2:18. Are you willing to be a blessing to others and a beacon in the dark? Are you taking things to the Lord or taking the easy way out? Bible study questions. Group study. 1. List the characters and their relationship. Who shut up the womb of Hannah? Verse 5. 2. When did Hannah pray to God? Verse 9. 3. How did Elkanah treat Hannah? Verses 4 to 5 and 7. How did Peninnah treat Hannah? Verses 6 to 7. How did Hannah respond to Elkanah and Peninnah? Verses 7 to 8. 4. What did Hannah vow to God? Verse 11. In what kind of attitude did Hannah go to God? Verse 10. What attitude did she leave with? Verse 18. What advice did Eli give to Hannah? Verse 17. 5. Why was Eli's love to Hannah not assuring enough? Why was Eli mistaken that Hannah was drunk? Verses 12 to 13. Compare Peninnah and Hannah. Progression. Describe the progress of Hannah in prayer and her change as a result. From Doris, the psychologist's desk. When your spouse cannot solve your problem. Sometimes we expect marriage to solve all our problems. The truth is, it does not. If each individual has 5 problems, together you have 10 problems to solve. When you work together as a team, you may help each other resolve things more effectively. However, there are times when, despite love and all good intentions, your spouse cannot help at all. Each of us is still responsible for our emotional hang-ups and personal issues. Marriage requires us to own up to them instead of loading them onto others or blaming others for their misery. Hannah could have blamed Elkanah for the other wife's provocation or demanded that he do something about it. Instead of turning to men, she turned to God with her problem. In marriage, we are each responsible for our own spiritual growth. Our individual relationship with God is foremost. You can change your life only through Him, and your changed life may have a powerful impact on your spouse. Here are some tips we can learn from Hannah. 1. Come before the Lord and entrust your problem to Him. Bring your frustrations, longings, disappointments, fears, every emotion and every thought to Him. 2. Ask the Lord for wisdom to help you understand the problem differently. We may need to look beyond our immediate problem and gain insight in other things. Let the Holy Spirit guide you. 3. Seeking help from friends and family. From the Bible passage, Hannah did not exactly seek outside help. However, sharing with Eli gave him an opportunity to bless her. Today we have a church community of brothers and sisters in the Lord to support us in prayer. After going to God first, discern whether it is good to bring your matter to your own family. Sometimes we may be too self-focused, and they may help us see things from a different perspective. Also, we listened to our friends' problems, and we may realize that our problem is small by comparison. Group sharing. Option 1. Divide the group into men and women's group and have each group compile a list of problems their spouse cannot help at all. Read the list to the group. Select some of the items and discuss whether they are best handled individually with God or with others and why. Are there gender differences in the preferences of problem solving? How do we practice seeking God in all our problems? Couples sharing. Conduct an interview with your spouse. Listen attentively to learn how they like to solve their problems. Here are the interview questions. 1. When you were a child or teenager, from whom did you seek help? 2. Describe an incident when you learned that it is better to keep things to yourself than to share with others. 3. When did you first learn to seek help from God? You may need a follow-up sharing after the group session. The key is to learn each other's preferences in problem solving. You may need to find out how you can go to the Lord together and separately for your learning. I have learned that it is just as good to simply pray for our spouse and trust that the Lord will direct him or her on the matter without our interference.